This episode's topic of discussion is Zadie Smith's The Fraud, published in 2023. This is the first book by Zadie Smith that John and I have read, and, spoiler alert, we really enjoyed it. It begins as a kind of pastiche of the 19th century British social novel before metamorphosizing into something quite different. A social novel is a work of fiction in which a prevailing social problem, such as gender, race, or class prejudice, is dramatized through its effect on the characters of a novel. A social novel is also referred to as the Condition of England novel. The Fraud's beginning touches on all of these topics through the real historical personages of Eliza Touchet, the housekeeper and sometimes mistress of real-life author William Harrison Ainsworth, most famous for writing the smash hit of Jack Sheppard, a historical romance based on the life of the titular criminal, which actually outsold Oliver Twist at the time. Through following Eliza, Zadie Smith presents the Victorian era's gender, race, and class politics, as well as the life of famous literary personages with whom Ainsworth kept company, through the perspective of a familiar point of view, the liberal white lady. Eventually, Eliza becomes an avid follower of the Tichborne case, a popular and famous trial which concerned the claims of one Arthur Orton to be the missing heir to the Tichborne royal line. The claim, of course, was a false one, but Orton becomes something of a working-class hero, the figure of populist sentiment that even Eliza finds herself swept up in. It is here that the fraud becomes something quite different. And to say what that is would be to spoil the ensuing conversation, but suffices to say, John and I have a lot of fun trying to define what that something else is. We hope you enjoy the conversation. Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the Infinite Library Podcast 2024. I'm your host, Ben.
And I'm John.
And we're here to discuss Zadie Smith's The Fraud, published in 2023. Now, why are we reading this book, John?
Yeah, so, listener, Ben and I, one of the hardest questions we ever have to ask for the show is, what are we gonna read? Because unlike a lot of other shows who kind of do something similar to what we do, we don't have like a theme. The whole kind of point of the show is that that we're reading broadly and deeply in as many different parts of the metaphorical infinite library as we can. So I definitely was pushing to have us do something a little more contemporary. I feel like we've definitely hit up some fun kind of classics, and we've looked at books from semi-recently, but I really want to do something that was a little more current, kind of see what's going on in the mainstream literary world right now. And a couple months ago, I read a review of this book, The Fraud by Zadie Smith, in the New York Review of Books. I was somewhat interested by the description there and filed it away in my noggin for later. And when Ben and I were kind of pitching ideas for our next episode, we both looked at the Amazon page for this book, and we saw a review that kind of sealed the deal for both of us. Ben, would you want to read that for us?
Yeah, because, you know, when you're trying to decide what to read, there's a lot of factors that can influence you. And sometimes a cryptic Amazon review is just the right thing. You need to be pushed in a certain direction. Let's take a look at the review, because I think it's a good place to start. So 5 out of 5 stars. Title, I Feel Tricked. I'm gonna try to read this in the way it's pronounced with no gussing up, or the way it's written rather. As reader, a white male American of certain age, Anglophilic, steeped in the canon of Western literature, Smith leads me, unknowingly, into a typical seeming pastiche of 19th century narrative. Eliot, Trollope, Thackeray, Austen, etc., some ballsack even. Then she switches on midstream. Suddenly, it's the colonialist, racialist background to all that. Never has literary genre bait and switch been more phantasmagorical. It could almost be categorized as Afro-retroism.
So, yeah, we read that, and we both stumbled on that review at the time. It was the very top of the review list on the Amazon page, and we were like, this sounds like something we gotta read.
Yeah, literary bait and switch is more or less what I look for, because I want to be surprised and hoodwinked.
And I was so tickled by the term Afro-retroism. I've heard Afrofuturism plenty, but Afro-retroism was a new one, and I was like, what's going on here? I knew there was a race element to this book from reading that New York Times review of book set review, and but I was very interested in kind of what that would come to. So yeah,
and I think also, John, for me, when we were talking about it as we were reading it, the moment where the switch happens, suddenly I was like, oh, okay. And that happens like kind of maybe halfway through to like, I'd say about halfway through the book, maybe. But like that's suddenly I was like, and we'll talk about it, but suddenly I was like, oh, okay, I really dig what's going on. And it took like until that bait and switch, and I'd almost forgotten about it. So
yeah, I think you and I are both kind of on the same page that the kind of opening stretch of this book, it's not bad, but it definitely like the bait and switch is really where this thing gets its hooks into you.
Yeah.
And before that, if you don't kind of have that in your sights, is like, okay, there's going to be a point where this makes a turn and it's going to get a lot more, for lack of a better term, exciting. The first stretch might be a little bit of a slog if you're not into this kind of book.
Well, and as the review hints at, suddenly there's a race perspective on what happens that kind of deepens the concerns of the book, and it's given its own kind of space to work as opposed to kind of being interwoven. It's like suddenly we hear this one character who's been heard a lot, and he gets to tell his story, and it really adds a lot of stakes to what's happening.
Yeah, it really just shifts your whole perspective on what before that, yeah, is reading like just kind of a good, but at the end of the day, not amazing like pastiche of your kind of classic 19th century social novel with maybe kind of a slightly more modern cast to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Before we kind of dig deeper into this text specifically, Ben, I know you want to talk a little bit about Zadie Smith. For those of you who are uninitiated, Smith is a British writer of Black descent. She has been kind of a big deal in, I would say, mainstream literature for quite some time. I don't mean that in a disparaging sense. She's definitely not like a pop author. Like she doesn't write like Harry Potter type stuff. I'd say she's very much, if you're kind of into literary fiction, she's a name you know. She wrote her first book, White Teeth, when she was 26 years old. And that was in kind of the late 90s. And yeah, she's just kind of been a presence in literary fiction for quite a few years now. And this is obviously her latest book. But I know you have a particular kind of aspect of her work and history you wanted to talk about. Do you want to share that?
Yeah, so as John was saying, I think contemporary literary fiction is where I would also put her. And she was often brought up in conversations with like Dave Eggers, David Foster Wallace, Don DeLillo. And my roommate in my master's program was in an MFA. And so obviously he was reading a lot of that stuff because he wanted to write it. And he would often read me parts of Zadie Smith's White Teeth at the time, which I don't know why I wasn't reading, because I was like a big DFW head at the time. It would have made sense to read Zadie Smith, but I wasn't reading her for some reason. And one of the terms that we used to talk about, which was coined by someone to refer to this body of work as hysterical realism, which when John and I were discussing whether or not to talk about this, we're not really sure what hysterical realism is. But I want to bring it up because I think it's an interesting like signifier of like what people were saying about White Teeth and about her contemporaries. And it was coined by James Woods in, I believe, the New Republic.
Terrible magazine. In
the failing New Republic. Yeah.
Terrible writer. But yeah, hysterical realism. Maybe there's something to it. I don't know.
Well, and I think that looking at James Woods is interesting because it'll be we might be able to place like where she started, and I think Woods, he seems to dislike Smith's tendency towards caricature and invention, while she's also attempting to tell a realist story. And I think in The Fraud, she's leaning more towards social realism and sort of, well, not social realism, but like the social novel is like sort of a realist story about people. And there's not sort of like madcap invention and satire, which was definitely in her book, White Teeth. And I think, like, again, Woods is sort of like this frowning moralist who wants all of the stories to be like not too exciting and not too ridiculous, but also have like a clear moral message at the end. And I pulled out this specific quote where he's discussing White Teeth when it came out. And he goes, "Which way will the ambitious contemporary novel go? Will it dare a picture of life or just shout a spectacle?" And as he says about White Teeth contains both kinds of writing. And I think, he's a little bit unfortunate with the sort of madcap, or he doesn't like that stuff. And I think if, you were to read Infinite Jest, which he also refers to, Infinite Jest has, some would say, too much shouting spectacle and too much madcap invention when it's trying to tell a serious story about addiction in American media. And I think in this book, which Zadie Smith has written after writing many books, I think she's going for something a bit more, I would say, like, again, realist, but there's still moments of like satire and sort of hilarity, I would say. And so, but there's not a whole lot of like madcap invention that James Woods might frown at. And now, of course, nobody really talks about James Woods. We found that quote where Harold Bloom was, what was he referring to Woods as? He was just writing him off. He's like, a nothing. He's like, I don't care about this guy. Yeah,
he does not exist.
Yeah, they're like, if people try to get me to read James Woods' book, and I say, please don't send me his book.
I don't want to throw it away.
And it was something that, like, me and my roommate would talk about, because like we were interested in telling stories that were fun and sort of like, exciting, but that weren't necessarily like closely observed interactions between people where people have revelations. Like, my roommate was a big Joy Williams head, and Joy Williams is all about like weird people interacting and, importantly, not learning anything. Joy Williams is very good about people like not learning from what happens or like missing the point. And that might be something we talk about with The Fraud, because who knows if somebody learned a lesson in The Fraud, but I guess we'll decide once we talk about it. But yeah.
So I feel like this is as good a time as any to kind of really talk about this book in a little more detail. I feel like we've given a little background on Smith. I feel like we've tried to kind of place her in terms of her contemporaries and her influences as much as you can when you're working from a terrible article by a terrible critic like James Wood. But The Fraud. So let's talk about The Fraud. That's what we're here to do. That's what we're going to do.
Yeah.
This podcast is not a fraud. And so we're going to give you, the good people, what you came here for.
We're the real deal.
So, the central character of this novel is Eliza Touche, a widow living in kind of late 18 or mid to late 1800s. And is London?
I believe so.
Yes, they're in London. What am I? Of course, they're in London. Yes, in London. In kind of the 1860s when the novel begins. The novel plays a lot with time. It cuts between kind of the present and the past very freely, kind of between chapters. But at the time we kind of start the book, she is in probably about her like early 60s. And she is serving as the kind of live-in housekeeper for her cousin, Mr. Ainsworth, who is actually a real historical author. William Harrison Ainsworth, who was sort of a historical novelist, contemporary of Charles Dickens and William Makepeace Thackeray, who serves as, I'd say, kind of the not quite the deuterotagonist, I guess like the tritagonist, if we're going to be generous, of the novel. But when we start, she is his housekeeper. She's kind of managing his household with his three spinster daughters and his new Cockney wife. The houses, they're clearly very poor, or not very poor, but they've fallen on harder times. William has not had a successful novel in quite some time, and
it should be noted briefly that Eliza Touche basically moved into Ainsworth's house after her husband and child left her. And they had Eliza Touche and Ainsworth had kind of a brief thing. And then even Touche had kind of a brief thing with Ainsworth's first wife who died. And then Ainsworth marries a maid who is his second wife. The second Mrs. Touche, or the second Mrs. Ainsworth is what Touche refers to her as.
Yes, and we enter the story basically right before that second wedding happens, and it's definitely like a source of friction in the household, and that is kind of where things begin. That is sort of the initial framing. The real backbone of the plot is centered around something called the Tichburn case, which was a real historical trial that took place in this time period where a man claimed to be the long lost heir of a noble house, the House of Tichburn. The heir had supposedly died at sea some years previously, and this man arrived supposedly from Australia, claiming to be this man who had been presumed dead for this, at that point, like 20 some years.
Yeah, Sir Roger Tichburn is the man that he's claiming to be.
Yes. And obviously there's the man is very clearly not the heir. The heir was a francophone. The supposed heir cannot speak a word of French. They don't look anything alike.
Yeah, the claimant, the supposed heir, is just like a huge fat guy.
He's a big, working class fat guy with no education. At some point, they ask him if he knows about chemistry, and he's like, "Is that what medicine is?" And it's like, "No, that's a chemist's shop, sir." And so this trial was kind of a farce, but it was also sort of a big flashpoint between in terms of kind of class conflict in London at this time. Obviously, this is like kind of the early Victorian era. And so there's a lot of class conflict. The commons are being enclosed, Ben.
There's no free land. Yeah, there's no free land for anyone. And the claimant is just trying to get paid like your average Joe. So we should support him.
And so we kind of follow the course of this trial along with Eliza's past and present. And part of the reason she takes up an interest in the trial is because Eliza is a big lib.
Yeah, she cares about social issues, John. Shouldn't we all care about social issues?
Yes. So Eliza is an abolitionist. She is kind of she in her youth, kind of after being widowed, essentially. Ben said that they left and then promptly died of scarlet fever.
Yeah.
So she's fully widowed at this point, which is kind of why she's able to live unattached. But she kind of loses the reason she had to live in a certain sense, and she kind of takes up social causes from there in a very earnest, but I think as we kind of learn more about her, a not entirely like unself-interested way.
Yeah.
And sort of, I think kind of the central conceit of like this kind of initial part is Smith, Zadie Smith, a Black woman living in 2023, kind of writing about an older white progressive lady and kind of using history as a way to distance that and maybe have it come across like a little less mean-spiritedly than it might if she was writing in the here and now.
And also to kind of engage in a little bit of history, because like Eliza Touche did exist and she did throw parties for Ainsworth and she did interact with like Thackeray and Dickens and like novelists of the time. And she probably did have an opinion on the Tichburn trial. And so Zadie Smith is kind of like putting us there, one, to talk about these historical events that actually happened, two, to kind of talk about like the figure of like the liberal white woman sort of throughout history. And I would say three, to kind of comment on like the usefulness of a novelist to talk about social issues, which I think is like sort of like another kind of thread that Zadie Smith's kind of working with.
So before we kind of get to the turn, like let's take a little time and talk. I want to talk a little bit about, kind of this first chunk of the novel, because like we said, this is the part that both of us kind of had a little bit of trouble with. Ben, what are your, like, are you a fan of this kind of literature, broadly speaking? The 19th century social novel, your Dickens, your Thackeray, your et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I mean, I do have a really soft spot for Middlemarch, which I would put along these lines. And like, they even bring up Middlemarch, and Elijah Touche at one point says, like, like a George Eliot, a woman, she had to pretend to be a man in order to get published. And
Ainsworth is like, garbage. All these women, all they write about is people interacting with each other. Where's the history? Where's the plot?
I'm writing about history. I'm writing like, and Ainsworth, it should be said, got famous for writing a Gothic novel, which is set in like England, I think, like a Rookwood. And then he wrote Jack Sheppard, which is sort of like a criminal tale of like a man who like loves his mother but has to commit crimes. And it's sort of like an Oliver Twist kind of esque story.
Not to take us off the topic, but some of the funniest parts of this are when he's writing Jack Sheppard and he's talking about how he like has learned all this stuff about like criminals.
He's like, Cockney people talk like this.
Starts basically doing the white people drive like this, black people drive like this bit from The Simpsons. But about like Cockney slang.
Cockney slang, people say this when they actually mean this. And like he's fascinated by this sort of like world that he's writing about, where he casts these like, other novels. It's just about people talking to each other. I think they are good. I do think I don't necessarily reach for them all the time, but to me, it's sort of like eating your vegetables. It's like, you gotta have to eat this. You're gonna have to read this stuff, and it's good for you. And while it might not be, your fancy meals or your hamburgers or whatnot, it's still like really good and it's like definitely the way people were writing about issues or doing literature at the time.
Yeah. It's something that I've been trying to develop a taste for this. I grew up kind of reading a lot of like sci-fi fantasy stuff, and I always kind of resented the fact that people kept trying to make me read like Dickens and whatnot. I always liked like Shakespeare, and like I always liked anything with like kind of more of a medieval twist to it, but like this stuff always just turned me off for the longest time. And then when I kind of had my conversion experience and became a canon guy a couple years ago, it's like now I'm kind of trying to reground myself. And this stuff, there's a reason why so many people who write the stuff you like now like this stuff is right. I guess what I have to say. I don't know that it's necessarily always to my taste, but I think there is a lot here. And the figures, what I like and what I think this book does a good job of too is it grounds you in this world, and it does kind of show you like what was going on and like what these people were doing, people like Dickens and Thackeray, and why it was exciting at the time. So we both read this article, Entering History, Zadie Smith and the Condition of the Social Novel by Rosemary Ho in the Point magazine, which we both, I think, liked a lot. And she has a great little bit in there about how these social novelists were writing at the point of a gun. There is this element where it's like we kind of forget now because we have, this is all the past to us now. But one thing that this novel really does make clear, it's like, oh yeah, like life was terrible for like so many people at this time. Like this was not like a pleasant time to be alive for like 80 to 90% of the population. Before we even get into the race and like slavery stuff, like being working class in England was not fun, even if it was better than being a slave. And the kind of, I think the impulses of people like Dickens that now kind of read as a little bit cheesy or smarmy to be like so like humane and like reformist minded, like they were coming from like a place of like, I don't know if I want to call it radicalism, but it's like there was like a genuine feeling there. It wasn't just, we're so used to now kind of the social novel, kind of the liberal novel as this kind of like moralizing, syrupy, treacly garbage. And
you should care about this thing more or less. It's sort of like wagging your finger and saying like, pay attention to this,
Yes. And, we kind of know with hindsight that it's like, yes, that is bad because it doesn't work. At the time, they didn't know that. So, if some actually good books came out of it, phenomenal. What can we say?
There's also that excellent quote from the article about the impact of like people like Dickens writing about these issues. And she says, the present splendid brotherhood of fiction writers in England, observed a somewhat obscure journalist named Karl Marx, have issued to the world more political and social truths than have been uttered by all the professional politicians, publicists, and moralists put together. So even Karl Marx was like, they're saying this stuff that nobody else is saying. These novelists like Dickens, they're talking about, working conditions that everyone else ignores or just assumes they don't even know exist.
Folks, should I say it? I'm going to say it. Slavery's bad.
Well, and also Orwell has that great essay of Dickens where he's like, Dickens was actually talking about stuff. He was a little afraid of mobs, and Orwell talks about how he has like this fear of like mob culture, but Dickens was saying things that like are true and that nobody was talking about at the time.
Well, I think that that's a real core tension in the novel, and I think we'll get to that. We kind of again get to the turn. Part of what this book is really grappling with, and I think Smith is grappling with, is like a Black person, but also someone who seems to be like a very well-off means at this point in her life. Kind of the classic dichotomy between there is injustice in the world, but we can't necessarily just tear everything down overnight. But we also can't pretend that if we just keep waiting, that the arc of history will do the work for us and we'll just get to justice. And
yeah,
that's a real central tension here. And I think that, Dickens is a great example of that, because he wanted the world to be hurtling towards utopia, but he also did not want to be scared of that happening. And so it always had to be kind of within the niceties of his kind of middle class sensibilities, where people just decide to be good eventually.
And sort of like criminals get or people that may commit crime eventually become like contributions to society, and they don't kind of like get killed or hung. It's like, oh, well, he got better. He, joined this institution. He improved his station in this respectable way, that kind of stuff.
And again, at the time, that's radical. When you have a society where it's like the position towards crime is like, well, we will hang you or we will send you to Australia to be worked to death. It's like,
remember, and Ebenezer Scrooge, are there no poorhouses? Are there like why doesn't he just go there? Like and everyone's like, you monster.
So definitely, like, as I looked back at this first section of the book, which is it's really just a lot of reflections on kind of it. It's Eliza reminiscing about the past, about Frances, William's first wife, who she loved and kind of developed this passion for social progress with her, and really threw herself into it after her death, and kind of just her relationship with William, which, yes, like Ben said, at one point was sexual. They kind of almost had like a throuple dynamic for a while.
Yeah.
And it seemed like, and also there's this element where she's looking back because it looked like William was going to be very successful. And then all of a sudden he wasn't. And all these friends he had, like Dickens, like Crookshank, who's this kind of famous cartoonist who's become William's bête noire by this point in time. They have, they've left him behind.
Well, I want to mention real quick, in Ainsworth's Fall is because, Jack Shepherd comes out at the same time Oliver Twist comes out, and Jack Shepherd actually sold
Oliver Twist.
And outsells Oliver, and people are creating songs and plays, and like everyone is just going crazy for Jack Shepherd. And then I believe somebody, I can't remember exact role, it's either the butler or the valet, kills.
There's a butler who kills his master and blames. It's basically like has like the Columbine defense, where it's like violent novels made me do this.
Yeah, Jack Shepherd because again, in Jack Shepherd, he's a criminal, but he's like a man of the people, but he doesn't get reformed, unlike Dickens. And so anyway, like he blames Jack Shepherd, and then everyone's like, man, Ainsworth is a bad novelist. He's giving people the wrong sense of what they should do. He's corrupting them. There's too much like sex and violence in, I don't know if there's sex in Jack Shepherd, but there's too much violence in that book. And that's when sort of Ainsworth falls on hard times, more or less. And he's suddenly not selling as well. Yeah.
Again, it's like that's kind of what I think Rosemary Ho's getting to, and she's like, these people are writing under the barrel of a gun. It's like the novel was like in a way that's like so strange now, because again, now all this stuff is canonical. All this stuff is like stuffy.
Yeah.
And back then it's like, no, this stuff was like considered to be like, if not trash, then like pornography or just dangerous.
Yeah, you can't have too many poor people reading Jack Shepherd, otherwise they go crazy. Like yeah, that's crazy to me.
Well, and you know, it's like it's the destabilization of like mass literacy, I guess. At some level, it's like they don't want poor people reading at all.
Yeah, and so Ainsworth falls on hard times. I also wanted to talk about, I think the relationship between Eliza and Ainsworth is interesting, because like when they're kind of a thing, she describes Ainsworth as being like open and free and had a great capacity for joy, and he wasn't trying to dominate. And then at some point, like, he becomes this like stuffy old man, and some of the early parts of the book are like them arguing about the claimant and the Tichborne trial, and Targe is like, well, I said Targe. Everyone calls her the Targe, which is the Scottish word for like a shield. So it's like when she's like charging into battle to defend basically the claimant, Ainsworth is like, I don't know about that. like I think he's making it up. I think people are getting the wrong thing from it.
Well, it's interesting because, yeah, I think that the implication in the book is basically that Ainsworth, at least when he's with Eliza, is a sub.
Yeah. So,
you know, again, they're not using that language because it didn't exist at the time, but there is kind of this element, like Eliza is described as being like, she's like tall and dark and like looks very strong for a woman.
And she's his Scottish wife as well. Yeah.
Yes, she's Scottish, not English, which obviously gives her like a certain caste to, you know, within the bizarre racial politics of blighted Albion.
Who knows what those are? That's why they call her the Targe, because it's like a shield that she charges into battle with to be like, hey, I think you're wrong about this trial, basically, to like all the men in the room, stuff like that.
But I think that basically, I think that kind of the implication is that Ainsworth, when he thinks that, you know, I think this is a book in a lot of ways. This is a book about like having your hopes are dashed. Like that is what it is to be in the world a lot of the time. And like Ainsworth was part of this circle of people with Dickens and Thackeray who thought that they were going to change the world, that they were going to change English letters, they were going to change English society. And then money gets involved. Dickens becomes way more successful than any of the other people in the group. And all of a sudden he doesn't have time for them anymore. He dies. He gets buried in, you know, Canterbury Cathedral, like a saint or a hero. Whereas like William is moldering in this house where at the beginning, like the opening incident is that they're like the roof of one of the rooms of the house is collapsed because he has so many books stacked on it, like on this floor, and it just collapses because the house is so old and shitty at this point and has been so poorly maintained. And so I think that like William is you know, we never get into William's head. We really only get into two characters' heads. And one of those people is literally like narrating to us. So it's a little different. We're really only ever in Eliza's head. We're for the most part.
Except for the turn. Yeah. Which
we'll get to the turn.
Yeah.
But again, that's what I mean. Like, but that's being narrated to us. That's within the text. Like that is a narration. So I think it's a little different.
True. Yeah.
But we don't see kind of William's own thoughts. But I think that he's someone who he's like a lot of people, like you get older and you get resentful. And in some ways that makes you more conservative. That's not even necessary, but like he's gotten more defensive of the privileges he does have, which in his case are that he kind of has this inherited status. The Tichbornes aren't quite not the Tichbornes, the Ainsworths, like they aren't exactly like nobility, but they're definitely like gentry. And so he's become defensive that he's uncomfortable with kind of big upsets to the status quo in a way that Eliza still thinks like are in her interest in some way, whether that's emotional or material.
And like he also sort of you know, Jack Shepherd was a contemporary novel, but then he sort of takes refuge in the past and he writes these sort of past historical novels that aren't as potentially unsettling or upsetting as Jack Shepherd was, and which are sort of like cliched. Like there's an early bit in this first part where
Elijah Touche like is sort of like his editor, kind of, even though she doesn't like say cut this or do this, but she gets to read everything, and she reads this Jamaica novel he's working on, and the ending is like this sort of sentimental scene that is just taken out of a different book.
He read like a very rosy like travel guide to like vacationing in Jamaica, and there's one scene in his Jamaica novel that's basically like Jamaica is a tropical paradise and she missed it so much as she died.
Yeah, and then Touche is just like, nah.
It really disappoints Eliza because she thinks he's going to write this fiery, condemnation of the state of Jamaica.
Yeah, and the sugar slave trade at the time as well. So
yeah, and then it ends up being kind of just a very formulaic romance where at the end it's like Jamaica is only referenced in passing. And but I think that's really interesting too, because I think that is Smith kind of preempting like critique of this novel itself, because she is kind of doing the same thing. This is, if you're going to like write a book about kind of like literary history, this is in a way kind of the safest period you can choose. It's the period of time where like you have these names you can just pull out of a hat, and even people who like don't read know who Charles Dickens is.
Right.
There aren't, more and more, there are less and less people who maybe people can name, but like people Zadie Smith hangs out with know who like William Makepeace Thackeray is. They know who Oscar Wilde is. They'll get these references in a way that maybe if you were writing about, I don't know, the literary scene in like America at this time, maybe you'd have less people to kind of go with, but maybe not. That might just be Zadie Smith being British.
Speaking of that, Edgar Allan Poe makes a brief appearance, which we don't have to talk about, but yeah, like Poe would have been an American contemporary, Melville, maybe some of the Transcendentalists. So, but those don't show up. It's really only Poe. So,
but Smith, I think, is doing something interesting here. I think she's actually writing from the past. Not so much to hide what she's doing, but I think actually in a really clever way, she's making it more complicated.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think she's hiding in the past. Something that was driving me, I read a couple other reviews from some bad magazines in preparation for this. That's the blessing and the curse of doing kind of like a more mainstream popular novel for the shows. There's a lot more kind of supplemental reading we can do, but I read some reviews in like the New Yorker and the Atlantic and Slate in preparation for this, just because I kind of just wanted to see what other people made of this novel, and I should have known better because those are all terrible magazines written by cretins and read by imbeciles, but all of them were making the obvious comparison of the claimant to Donald Trump,
which Rosemary Ho even mentions very briefly. She doesn't really dwell on it. Yeah,
all these reviews were dwelling on it because, again, these are magazines written by morons to be read by the dumbest people in the world. But it is an obvious comparison. Again, the claimant is, again, described as kind of this big fat oaf who's clearly lying, but somehow manages to like get the populace like whipped up in support of him to like give him money and shit. But like, I don't actually think that Smith, like, I think Smith knows that that's an obvious comparison. I think that from the standpoint, like, when you're writing, you write in the time you live in, and stuff's going to make its way in no matter what you do.
Yeah.
But I don't think that like that's really what she's trying to say. She's not really writing the claimant to be Trump. She's asking way bigger, like more interesting questions than that about, but she's asking questions about, what's the role of an artist in history? What is the role of, frankly, like comfortable people in a world full of oppression, yet, limited by their circumstances. And I don't, I think we'll get to this more as we get towards the end of our discussion, but like, this is not a book that like has easy answers. And that's what I really appreciated about it. That's why I find the Trump comparison so like insulting to the book, because that's such an easy read. And it's such an easy way out for these liberal white people who read the Atlantic to just be like, I do not support the claimant. I'm Eliza. I'm a good person. And the arc of history is long. It bends towards justice, which means I can just sit here and read Jeffrey Katzenberg's horrible rag and feel good about myself.
Well, and to me, the more fascinating. So obviously, when you write a historical novel, you're going to be looking into it with the lens of the present. But to me, the more fascinating thing that came out was the anti-vax stuff, which gets talked about very briefly. But I kept thinking about it because they, the people love the claimant, and they published these like sort of self-made magazines about the claimant trial. There's all of this like physical culture stuff, like these weird, small trinkets and like various things about the claimant. But Eliza makes a note of reading, because she's fascinated with the claimant. She reads these magazines about him, and they proliferate with anti-vax theories. And
also stuff about how the suffrage should be universalized, how land should be like recommunized. But yeah, also anti-vaccine stuff.
Yeah, and like I don't know the state of vaccine technology at that time, but yeah, it's like these sentiments get like yoked together, and that seems to me more interesting than being able to point and say that guy's Donald Trump, and then being like, if I was Eliza, if I was that time, I would have not been into him either. And Eliza is sort of like, and Rosemary Ho makes that point, like she sees it more as like, we're fascinated with Trump as liberals because we don't know why he's getting away with it. And we're like, it's like what is it? What is that like thing where they do a reading of one of the first testimonies against Trump? And it's like a giant, the Mueller report, like that kind of stuff. Like, we're going to find out. Yeah, the documents. Exactly. And so like, that's her angle on it. But like the anti-vax stuff was fascinating because it's like, this, populist sentiment that has things that I think we would agree with, but also has like stuff like anti-vax, sentiment in there. And like Zadie Smith doesn't really do anything except I think report on the connection, which I think was fascinating, giving us kind of like after, 2020. So
yeah. No, definitely. I kind of to loop back to what I was originally saying when we kind of got off on this tangent. I think that like if she had written a contemporary novel with kind of the same spin on it, like we kind of, I said at the beginning, like, I think that it would have been a lot harder for her to kind of tell this story from like a white woman's perspective without having it come across as probably like a lot more like catty, which I don't necessarily like. I don't think would be a bad thing, but I think would probably make like a lot of people in the literary circles Zadie Smith runs in more angry. And I think would also probably just the Trump stuff would probably come across as like a lot hackier. Like I think that she's drawing parallels, but she's not trying to like connect these dots and say like this is exactly the same thing. And again, she's also not offering an answer at the end of this. There's no bow to tie this up with where someone could come away with this if they really want to make that Trumpian reading and be like, and this is what we do about it. It's like,
and like it's literature. It's not supposed to give you easy answers. It's not supposed to be didactic. And even though like these novels at the time were considered to be didactic, like you can still do things that are more complex and interesting and get you to think about stuff, which is ultimately the point. Not say, oh, I'm going to do this like allegorical reading of, I don't know, Trumpian politics. And again, it seems like we only get reportage about it. And, the early part of this book that we've been talking about is like focuses on people arguing about who did what and who do we believe and what are the facts in the situation that lead us to think that he really is Roger or he's a fraud, the titular fraud. So
I think that probably is kind of a good place for us to transition and talk about the much vaunted turn we've been referring to.
Right, which is when the book made sense for me personally, as I've said.
Yeah, I think that I kind of knew this was coming in a way maybe you kind of weren't. I knew you knew this was coming, but like I kind of knew when it was going to happen because I'd read all these reviews. So we haven't really talked about this character yet, but part of the Tichborne case, which again, real historical case, this is a real historical person we're going to be talking about right now, was a man by the name of Andrew Bogle. Bogle was a black man, former slave born in Jamaica, who had been employed by the Tichborne family for a number of years before basically moving to Australia after being granted his freedom, saving up some money, et cetera, et cetera. He, at some point in Australia, hooked up with the guy who was the claimant in this case, whose name, as far as we can tell, is actually, I believe, Arthur Orton.
Yeah.
But we'll refer to him as the claimant. And Boggle was kind of the keystone of this case. He had been in the Tichborne house when Sir Roger was a boy. He claimed to have known Roger fairly well. And he said, he basically like got up on the stand and said, this guy is Roger Tichborne. I would know him, like I would know my own son, more or less. And so this was really like the number one like piece of evidence in terms of this guy being who he said he was.
And everyone is so won over by his testimony because to all effects, he appears to be telling the truth and is not being deceptive.
Yeah, a lot is made of Boggle. He's not like a great like fiery orator or anything, but he gives off this air of like quiet charisma and like dignity that seems to convince people of his truthfulness, despite, again, kind of the patently ridiculous nature of what is going on right now.
And convinces Eliza as well. Very, very much so. Yeah.
So basically the turn happens. There is a huge blow up at the trial. And there's basically like a riot in the courthouse, and Eliza uses this as an opportunity to approach Boggle and be like, hey, I am a writer. I want to learn more about this case. I think that like if we can tell your story to people, people will understand why you're going to bat for the claimant, and maybe that will help him like make his case.
And importantly, Eliza had she'd been around Ainsworth. She's been throwing literary parties, and she actually, in witnessing the trial, wants to start writing. So it's sort of like a character development for her to sort of reach out and attempt to do this.
Yes. So they like go have a meal, and this is where the novel makes the turn. So before this, from a formal standpoint, the chapters we have been reading have been very short, sometimes as short as like half a page for some of these chapters. I'd say like the median's probably like 3 to 4 pages per chapter. And at this point, when we sit down and we hear Boggle's story, all of a sudden the chapters become much longer. We probably like, I'd say maybe 5 chapters in Boggle's shoes, but it probably goes for like a good like 100 pages.
Yeah, and it's kind of presented in almost like this continuous stream. And it's not all his voice, but like, time skips, things like move really quickly. We're suddenly not doing this thing where we jump around from moment to moment, and we get this sort of long spiel. And I was like totally hooked at that point. I was like, okay, all right. Like suddenly you're getting like kind of the flip side to all of this stuff that has been presented from the outside. Yeah.
So basically it's really interesting. It almost like has, and maybe this kind of gets back to hysterical realism. There's almost like kind of a, not quite a magical realist element to this, but it almost reads a little bit that way. I was reminded a lot of like 100 Years of Solitude when I was reading the initial part of the section, because Boggle recounts like his family history, basically from his father's life in Africa up to like him being kidnapped and brought to Jamaica, and then his life, and then eventually like his Andrew's birth, and then his life. And he does all this with like a level of like detail and like authority that, it's something like I feel like almost like borders on supernatural.
Well, and the narrative voice, it kind of does first person right, like it sort of zooms out a little bit. Like it's really close on Eliza, then it's really close on Andrew, and then it like takes a step back, and suddenly it's like sort of the scope of history almost.
Yeah. And so we really watch kind of this horror story where this boy is kidnapped and brought to Jamaica and like worked as a slave and kind of worked like climbs the corporate ladder basically.
Yeah.
To the point where he's like he is able to kind of pass on like a level of respect and like dignity that he's won over time to his son, that his son is kind of able to then by luck and merit, you know, kind of like again kind of a almost like Great Expectations-y fashion, like he manages to work his way up in the world while also kind of keeping this I don't want to say like social responsibility, but like this he never forgets like where he comes from. And in a way that like maybe like a Dickens protagonist would like kind of wash his hands of like his past.
And like his father, I think it's, you know, is some sort of like royalty in Africa, and so like people in Jamaica were also slaves like refer to him as royalty, and like his father and him are people that write things down. They're like the accounters for the plantation house, and so like that's a pretty good job, you know, for obvious reasons, and they take it very seriously. And so yeah, there's this sort of like, you know, I am trying to be an important person, but I'm passing this on to my son because it's all I can really do in this situation because I am a slave. So like it's sort of like this intensity that like you don't really get in the rest of the book, because, well, yeah, I mean you do in some way, but like suddenly it's like the sort of like what was happening on the flip side to all of this, like, you know, Society of Manners, like literary salon stuff. It's like, oh yeah, Britain was running a slave system in Jamaica and profiting from the sugar trade in you know, in ways that like aren't really talked about in modern society, but the book goes there for this like part.
Well, and it also it raises a lot of questions about what's even going on in the story, like the money and property that is being fought over in this trial is property that has been acquired through the exploitation of slaves. Like, there it is blood money. Like, it is like fucked. And, you know, I found the depiction of slavery in the book very, again, interesting, because again, kind of in the same way that Eliza is at this remove from the like horrors of her society, like Andrew is also kind of at this remove, like because he has managed to kind of maintain this position as kind of a scribe, like he is kind of spared a lot of the worst treatment, but he still sees what is happening to people. He never lets it fully like go to his head.
Yeah, but, and you know, he's in love with what is it, little Joanna. She ends up like having to basically go to like a prison and run on a treadmill for like 3 years. And you get
it drives her mad.
Yeah, it drives her crazy, and like you get her in her thoughts or her speech, and it's like circular, as if she's just like recounting this thing as she's walking on this treadmill over and over again.
One of the most amazing chapters in the book is here, where basically the narrative takes a break, so we just get this like prophetic speech from this mad woman who has been driven into like prophetic like hysteria by just the horrible treatment in this slave camp.
And what she says like ends up being true too. She talks about like this plant that is like preventing the sugarcane from like being harvested, and she says things that end up being true in the book as well, so it's not just like, you know, nonsense.
Well, and again, kind of to take us back to the historical realism, you know, you said there's a lot less kind of invention here, but something that is really interesting in this book, and again, it kind of gets into, again, maybe some magical realist influence here. When we get to this section, there's a lot about curses. Little Joanna kind of comes from a separate family line from Boggle, but her mother, like I think Big Joanna, is kind of this medicine woman, or maybe shaman. I don't know exactly enough about like Jamaican slave culture to say exactly like what role she would, you know, what people would have called her, but she and her daughter are kind of held to have this power of like cursing people. It's said that like when they curse someone, it comes true. And then there's a really interesting chapter a little bit later. Once we kind of end this part, we kind of get back to the Europe plot where we actually flip back even further in time to a completely different, basically we leave Eliza's head. We kind of just enter into like third person, like God narrator mode. And we're back in the 12th century. And we find out that there is like a curse on the Tichborne lineage because of this like grain dole that they were supposed to like keep going to the poor. And then they stopped. And that was supposed to be like when the line would die out.
Right.
And that happened like prior to Roger Tichborne dying at sea. And so there is kind of this weird element here where it's like there is sort of this magical element, this prophetic or like, yeah, kind of curse element to this book, which it's never fully like, it's not like she's a wizard. It's not like Smith like really goes all out and is like, oh yeah, like there's real magic going on here. It's always left ambiguous, but there is this element of like,
it's presented as realistically, like the characters say this is real and it's presented as real as the other stuff. It just happens to be like operating with a whole other like logical sense where it's like, of course they're cursed. Like, and like they go to little Joanna and they ask her for things and it's like, oh, you need to do this if you want, you know, to this kind of spell to work. It's treated completely seriously. And I wonder if like earlier Zadie Smith, because I haven't read White Teeth, it would have been like it would the extra realist stuff would have been presented as like more of a joke or like silly, and this is like taken like very like seriously,
like it's like gothic horror.
And I think like to me it adds this like layer of like stakes to everything that's happening, because it's like, oh, this is like the lived experience of like the flip side of these other stories where it's, you know, Elias is like, oh, I support these social issues, etc. And then like, you know, Andrew just tells her entire life, more or less, or some abbreviated version of it. And you get like, oh, okay, this is why he's defending this claimant, because he thinks it's actually good for him, even if he knows the claimant is, you know, lying, which he doesn't actually really say. But
yeah, that's what I was about to say. That's the really interesting thing through this whole thing. And again, it comes back to what I was saying earlier about like this book not offering easy answers. There's never what I think, again, there might be in either like a worse contemporary novel, or again, if we went back into kind of the more didactic style of like actual 19th century authors like Dickens, there might be a point in the book where a character would just come out and say, this is the reason I'm doing it. And it's for XYZ reason. I think it's going to lead to ABC outcomes. And that never happens. It is left ambiguous as to why he's doing it. If Bogle even fully knows why he's doing it. There's some real, like his psychology is at some of like a mystery even to himself. There's a really beautiful and like kind of heartbreaking passage about he's serving at like a dinner party and someone like makes a crack like about his race, or not to him directly, just like in passing. And he clenches a glass so hard that it shatters in his hand and like cuts him up, and he doesn't even notice it because
isn't that when they say, they're like, oh, Bogle never gets mad.
Yeah.
They're like, he never gets mad. Yeah.
So he's like had to sublimate like his actual like emotions so deeply to function that he's kind of a mystery to himself. At least that's how I read it. And there's a whole other element to that where it's like, again, everything we get about Bogle is him talking to Eliza. So there's an element too where it's presented in this omniscient way where like he has like this full knowledge of the past and is portraying it in like this almost like 100% undoubtable way. But it's also all being spoken over the table to this liberal white lady who he thinks maybe can help him in some way. And so, yeah, I don't have like an answer to like what I think maybe is or isn't true in his narration, but it again raises a lot of questions.
And we don't know how much actually gets through to Eliza, because like the narrative voice almost shifts a little bit where it's like, you know, at some point it starts out with, it's like, and then Bogle said this and then Bogle said that. But then at some point it's literally like, Bogle probably didn't know that this was happening, but we're being told, the reader. So we're like able to better judge why he did it than Eliza. But also, like you said, John, we still don't know. Like, there's still this like unknowable sort of aspect of it And I think him having to supplement his true feelings to like survive, as he was a slave and then he became sort of like a house servant almost like seamlessly. Like he's literally like, oh, you're like, they don't say like, oh, you're a house servant. It's like, oh, you'll accompany this guy, and then he's just there his entire life, which again is like crazy.
At some point again in passing, like he's basically just told like, oh, we're gonna start giving you a salary, and he's like, oh, I guess I'm not a slave anymore, huh?
Yeah. And he just started like, and there's a bit where he's like reading the newspaper and he's like, is this what I am now? Like remember he's like reading the newspaper in his house, like on like a day off or on like a Sunday or something.
Yeah. No, it fascinating character. Like I again, like you said, when you get to this section of the book, like it all like just clicks into this new focus. And again, not in a way where like it answers anything, but in this way where it's like all this stuff that you've been reading beforehand, like is suddenly problematized. There's a great passage after this point where Eliza basically says like, she says like, nothing real happened in England. It was all, party, like tea parties and boarding school graduations.
Literary bullshit.
And on the one hand, like that is still like an illusion of the truth because there is all this political ferment going on in England, but Eliza feels like all of a sudden, like all those struggles are immaterial because of the horror of Jamaica and the slave power.
Which, like, there's even a part where she points out that it took her a while to put those two together, like to realize that like England exists because of the slavery system and is making other people's lives so bad. At one point she saw those two issues as separate, and then she's like, oh, they actually exist, which like she comes to this point before, Bogle talks to her, but like for a while she didn't even know like those were related either.
Yeah, well, because she very much comes to like abolition from this very like kind of again, I think in a way that maybe we all see again happen with well-meaning kind of like left liberalish people, where you come to these causes again, not like self-interestedly, but like just very much from like the position of like, oh, I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do and I'm a good person. And then you realize like it's all tied together. There's this whole like world system which relies on exploitation and misery, and you realize like, oh, it's all one thing. And again, that doesn't make it any easier. It just makes it, I don't know, something.
Well, and too, like when Bogle tells her all this stuff, like before she's like, maybe I can represent your story, and then she realizes that like she can't. Like there's like so much lived experience and so much stuff to what he's been saying that like it's almost beyond her. And when you read it, it's like you're kind of bowled over because like Eliza isn't interjecting. Eliza isn't saying, oh, it's like literally you're just kind of bowled over by this narrative part of the book. And then he's like, yeah, that's my story, basically, like at the end.
Well, and I think that there's also an element where it's like, I think that there's a lot made again in this book about kind of like commercial literature and like what sells.
Yeah.
And I don't think this is a narrative that would have sold in 19th century England.
Right. Yeah.
I don't think that like a white lady like writing this for him like would have made it like a thing people would have wanted to have read.
Well,
at least that's what I feel like the implication is.
Yeah, and should we get to kind of like what happens after that, or do we? Because like I feel like what happens after this is also really important.
Yeah, let's finish the plot, and then we can kind of loop back if there's more we want to talk about.
So, crucially, like one, Andrew doesn't see any of the money. So there's money that's raised for the claimant, sort of like support the claimant, et cetera, et cetera. He doesn't see any of it. And Eliza like is sort of unable to kind of do the thing that she said to him. And she still talks to him and his son occasionally, but like she doesn't quite tell their story because she's not really a journalist. But like she says she is, and she wants to be, but she doesn't quite do that. And so like she kind of hangs out with the son, and the son and her kind of treat her like this sort of weird old lady. Like they refer to her as like the queer lady journalist or something, like at one point. And like she tries to write like this story kind of, and she does. It's called The Fraud. And like time basically moves on past all of this. and like Andrew eventually dies. She finds out about it secondhand, and she goes to the there was like a commons protest with Andrew's son, yeah, whose name is Henry, and like basically they have like an argument, right?
Yeah, well, this is this is kind of, I guess you would say this is, I think if we're talking in terms of kind of formal like English class like analysis, like this is the climax of the book. Eliza goes to this protest against like land enclosement, and she goes to Henry, and they, she's talking about how like basically like fired up and like jazzed up she is about like going to this protest and like participating and feeling like she's part of something.
And stuff that happens, something is happening in England. Yeah.
Yeah. And then Henry is basically we have kind of the archetypical argument between the well-off liberal and the young, more radical person. Race is obviously like an element here, but I think that Smith is drawing like parallels that you can see in these conversations, whether we're talking about race or another issue. But basically Eliza is like, things are happening, and if we just keep working over time, things will get better, and eventually things will be as good for you as they are for me, and things for me will be as good as they are for somebody else. And Henry's like, why should I have to wait for you? Like, if I'm really like a free person, why should I have to wait? Why can I not just take what is owed to me?
Yeah.
And Eliza is basically aghast by this by this black man talking to her like this, and that is like the last time she sees either of them.
And I think crucially, when he starts sort of telling her this, what you're saying is nonsense, I should be able to do what you can kind of do. And she's like, well, I'm a woman, I'm not the same as a man. And she's like, well, you can go anywhere you want. I can't do that. But as he's doing this, she starts narrating what's happening. Yeah. Like literally, like she starts writing as if it's happening. And I thought that was also really important, where like she's almost not even in the conversation. She's like outside the conversation, like, oh, and then he said this, the young radical yelled at me. And so she's both like not kind of understanding what he's saying and depicting it in like this weird, like removed way. And who knows if it made it into the book, but yeah.
And there's also, again, there's this little turn that happens in that scene, because when we said earlier that like we basically spend all this time in Eliza's head, forgot this one crucial scene. There is this one bit here where kind of in the middle of the chapter, we very briefly enter Henry's head, and he's looking at Eliza, and he's like, the queer lady journalist, was pacing back and forth and going on and on about her causes. Yeah. And I just smiled and nodded. And then, they get into this argument, and then all of a sudden we're back in Eliza's head. And like Ben said,
again, it's sort of interesting to think that this, this, as John said, is sort of like your archetypical conversation, but it happens like after all of the Bogle stuff. And so it's almost like we, the reader, kind of get it, but like Eliza doesn't. Yeah.
And from there, like Ben said, like the rest of the book kind of like, again, this is our climax. Everything from here is like the falling action. She hears Bogle. Bogle is like pretty old at the start of the story. By the time, the book ends, he's like 70 something, and he dies because he has had a very difficult life. So he dies and is dead. And then, it really kind of enters this very strange, not like almost, kind of phantasmagorical like section where all of a sudden time is passing very, very, very quickly. All of a sudden, like Eliza is with Ainsworth as he's dying, and she's trying to like finish her novel
sort of secretly, and it's also called The Fraud.
But then she realizes like Ainsworth was the only person she would have, like, she has to hide it from, so now that he's dead, she doesn't have to hide it.
So that's more or less the end of the book. However, the last line, not counting the afterword, is the mysteries of Mrs. Touche were finally unfathomable because William died, and he's the one who really knew her. And I think that's an interesting line. Now, I know Rosemary Home says that, like, this is the real plight of the white liberal lady, where she just kind of recedes into her own identity. And it's like, oh, I'm so complex and interesting, and I can't join history. And that's kind of like Rosemary Ho's arguments. I also take that last line to kind of be Zadie Smith taking a step back. And it's like, this, I've done all I can to talk about Miss Touche, and I have to stop here, kind of.
Yeah.
And also it's written in italics as if Elijah Touche was sort of narrating her own story. And I think one thing that I have been thinking about is sort of like the idea of like, yeah, it's like, it is sort of the problem of kind of, we could say like liberal politics, is that like you're still too invested in your identity as like a sort of person who is a good person, and you don't kind of get swept up in the cause. Because, like, I guess, like, if you were to swept up in the cause, you'd be there, you'd be fighting alongside, you know, Henry Bogle, and you wouldn't really care about you, kind of.
Yeah.
And I think, like, that's an interesting moment there, because, like, also, you know, like, yeah, what is this book saying about, like, getting invested in history, or being, like, you know, a person who is a good person, or who appears good and therefore is good? You know, it's like, because appearances are the only thing that matter. I don't know. It's a nice final line that I think, to me, like, kind of speaks to like what Zadie Smith was going for, which is like, yeah, the idea of like a subject of history who is a liberal, who wants to appear a good person, but is not quite willing to get swept up in everything that happens.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, there's a brief section where they reference the fact that, at this time, kind of in the background of all these other events, Karl Marx is founding the first International Men's Working Association, or Working Men's Association, which Eliza is not involved with at all. And again, presumably is probably like not quite the sort of like just engine of resentment that the kind of populist cause of the claimant is, where again, it gets wrapped up in all this bullshit about anti-vaccine stuff and again, helping this fat moron like get a bunch of money he doesn't deserve.
Yeah.
You know, so I feel like we kind of talked about this a little bit. We were talking about Masters of Atlantis, you know, kind of the way where when you're presented with social injustice, you kind of have like a couple different options. And one of them is like to try to like think, I guess, like materialistically or at some level, and like it's like, okay, this is what needs to be done, and like this is what we need to do it. And then you can also like retreat into mysticism, whether that's religious mysticism or kind of the mysticism of the self represented by liberalism, and kind of getting obsessed with like your own identity and you know, your own like personal morals. And I think that, again, Smith, I think, in a way that I think is very big, I don't know, broad-minded. I don't know exactly what word I want to use here, because I don't want to condescend and be like, Zadie Smith is a really smart lady. But you know, she doesn't act like this is an easy choice to make. Like, Eliza is limited. Like, at some level, I think there is an element where she probably couldn't just go join Karl Marx's Communist Party, because she has these personal responsibilities to her family. She has these, at some level, like kind of bullshit hangups about like being a woman and, you know, having to kind of step around Ainsworth. But those are, you know, these things that at some level are immaterial in a way, like they still affect us as individuals, and you can't just elide them entirely. And I think
your sort of social relations to other people are like just as much as a reality as your ideals or like what you want to do.
Yeah, you know, I think there's this kind of equally fantastic dream of kind of the socialist revolution, where it's like we will all realize like our material like interest, and we'll basically like become a benevolent hive mind, and we'll all give up.
Nothing to lose but our chains.
And it's like and we'll give up all our identities, and we'll just like become a mass to move history forward in a big push. And obviously that's a simplification, but I think that is like the dream of kind of a lot of more idealistic thinking about like what socialist revolution looks like. And I think that what Smith is kind of trying to point to here, and I don't know what her personal politics are, I don't know if she's a socialist or communist of any variety, but who knows? But she's kind of pointing to, again, like the thing about being an individual in history that's really hard is like you are both an individual and in history. And you can't align either of those to like make the other one easier.
And, you know, if you're a novelist, you can't, you know, just depict one or the other also. Because if you do just history, you know, it's either like the Ainsworth thing, or it's like, oh, it doesn't really matter. This book takes place in the past and is safe. Or it's like the sort of socialist realism to which Adorno referred to it as boy meets tractor literature, where it's just about like, oh, I have this tractor. I will serve the populace. You know, I am a selfless person who has no identity. Or it's like on the flip side, it's just like, yeah, too much identity, too much mystery of the self, which ultimately leads nowhere. So it's sort of like you have to strike this perfect balance between the two. And I think that's kind of what she attempted to do here.
Yeah, well, and you know, what I really found, something I found really interesting in this book, and the thing that really got my wheels turning on this question is there are some really fascinating passages in this book where a character has an experience with an art object. Which obviously that's something you and I think about a lot as I'll be generous and say we're independent critics.
Our own platform.
But obviously, you know, we've talked about it many a time in our personal conversations. You know, we both make like consuming art, for lack of a better term, you know, it's our thing, among others. But, you know, we all have these experiences where like, especially now in you know 2024, where like everything is so much more mediated even than like it was in Victorian London. Like we're all having these experiences with like these art objects, whether that's a book or a painting or a post that you know we think are affecting us and are changing the way we see the world. And I think that this book is it's trying to do that in a way, in a complicated way, but it's there are these scenes where someone will see something and it will change the way they look at the world. So the first time I noticed this happening in the book was Eliza Touche. She sees the famous, like, kind of, I guess you would call it like a cartoon. I don't know exactly what the right phrase for it is, but it's something I'm sure all of us saw like in our history classes growing up, the famous like abolitionist like drawing where it's like the slave kneeling and it says like, ain't I a man and a brother? And that is like the thing that suddenly like clicks in her brain that like she thinks slavery is bad. Like she basically sees like an 19th century meme and it like totally shifts her perception of reality. And like all of a sudden she has this new purpose in life. And then Bogle, there are these really fascinating bits in the Bogle section where he goes to the Tichborne like country manor, which is obviously this like I was picturing, because I watched Barry Lyndon like a couple weeks ago. I was imagining like one of the like country houses from Barry Lyndon, basically. But, you know, this ornate like English country manor, and there's obviously like all this beautiful art everywhere. And he sees
gratuitous displays of wealth.
Yes. And he sees two things in particular that like really like shift his like way of looking at the world. He sees like this kind of like it's not like a mantelpiece, but it's like this piece of statuary like worked into a wall, if I'm remembering exactly. But it portrays like a king and then like all these subjects like coming to the king. And then at the bottom, like kind of trod underfoot is like a black slave. And he's like, oh, like this is like the way the world is. And like that's me, even though like I'm here, I'm also there, like at the bottom. And so he sees this painting of like a young black man with like a bow and arrow, like hunting alone. And I think it's kind of like supposed to be like kind of a classical-ish scene. But for him, it like brings to mind like his sons and like maybe this idea that the world could be in some way like a little different. And I think Smith, again, like I think that it's her reflecting on kind of like what can art do? You know, I think that again, the questions raised by like this, and also again the stuff with like bringing in people like Dickens who thought art could change the world. People who care about art, people who make art. We have this idea that art can make people see the world differently, maybe make them better, maybe change the world. And I don't totally disagree with that. I don't take the view that art makes you a better person, that reading books makes you a better person. I don't believe the novel is like an empathy machine, as some people have called it. I think that whatever happens when you experience art, it's more complicated than that. And I think that's what's happening here. It's like you can have an experience with art. It can be powerful. It can be aesthetic, but it's always going to be like internal, and it's always going to be on you to actually make something out of that.
Yeah, it might be better to say art makes you a different person.
Yeah.
Because instead of a better person, morals, we should do this kind of thing. It's more like you experience art and then you are changed in some way.
Yeah.
And sort of defining what that change is the interesting part. And I think you've highlighted these moments where one, a character is changed, but also I think with the one that Andrew sees, he sees the thing of what it could be his son, and he's like, yeah, maybe my son could be that free one day, free as this guy is depicted in this painting. And then, then he sees the statue that is the order of things, and he's kind of crushed. But this still doesn't stop him from trying to create a world where his son can be free. And that involves going to Australia and even throwing in with the claimant, because his idea is that we could maybe get money to basically be provided for. And, I think that's what's also interesting too about what Smith is saying about the fraud, because we haven't really talked about who the fraud is.
Yeah.
On one hand, the fraud is the claimant. On the other hand, it could be Eliza Touché. But I mean, she does write a book. That is something. It's more than some people, more than some of us can say. And she is changed by her experiences in some way, even if it's not being so much so that she could kind of see what Henry is saying when he yells at her, as opposed to kind of depicting it as it's happening or at a remove.
Well, and I think that the interesting thing with the title is that it has that definite article, the there. It's saying it wants us to think there's one fraud, we need to be on the lookout for him. And yeah, the obvious answer is, oh, it's the big fat moron claiming that he's this guy he looks nothing like. Which again, I think we kind of talked about earlier. That's the easy answer, and
I'll tell you what, Donald J. Trump is a goddamn fraud. he's not who he says he is.
But I think kind of what I am taking away from this, at least, is that every character in this book is a fraud in some way, or at least the characters who maybe we see enough of to know their lives in that way. Because I think Eliza is the fraud, because she is, on the one hand, she claims all this progressiveness, but then she also has these obvious gaps in her understanding that she can't bridge. Ainsworth literally, we
haven't even talked about what she does with her inheritance too, which I think is important. But yeah.
Ainsworth literally at one point asks Eliza, "Am I a fraud?" Because the other thing with Ainsworth, there's a couple excerpts from his prose, and comes across very hacky. So I
the bit where he keeps using the phrase, instead of said, he ejaculated.
Yeah, I don't know what you've been, but after finishing this, I don't feel like I need to go out and read any Ainsworth.
Yeah, I don't.
And even Dickens, there's a lot of really interesting stuff about Dickens, where everybody, again, by the 1860s when the book starts, Dickens has just died, and he's kind of had developed this sainted reputation. Everyone's talking about how nice he was, how much he believed in social progress and improving the lives of the downtrodden. But then there's a lot of stuff about he's in the scenes we see him, and he's kind of a cad, he's always really sexist to Eliza. They make a lot of how he basically thought women just shouldn't ever talk. And the way that he treated people in this very instrumental way, where he was always just he was very friendly to people, but basically just because he was trying to get basically mine people for quirks that he could use to make characters for his novels, who usually are controllable by him. And it, Boggle, I think, is maybe the tough one, but I think, again, we were talking about earlier, we don't know how much of his story is true, and how much he believes about what he's saying about the claimant, you know.
So no, and I wonder too if like Bogle doesn't think he, like when they say, oh, Bogle's so nice as a servant, he doesn't get mad. And like Bogle realizes that he could get mad and he can't, you know,
Yeah.
like, and I think that's partly why he breaks the glass in his hand, because it's like, I should be mad. I should be like, you know, angry at these people for enslaving me, and he has to perform this duty because that's the only way he thinks he can to survive, basically.
Yeah.
And so like, yeah,
And so,
like I don't know. Yeah.
I think that like the fraud is again, this is kind of hacky, but the fraud is everyone. Like the fraud is the fact that like and again, this kind of to go back to what we were saying about art earlier, like we develop these ideas about ourselves, you know, through basically in a lot of ways, especially like basically from modernity on, you know, mass literacy on, you know, through mediation, through like the media we consume and take in, you know, we think that that says something about us, you know, our value as people and the ideas that we believe in. You know, the more books you read that are, you know, socialist, the better a socialist you are. The more books you read about art, the better an artist you are, whatever, you know, you want to say. But again, we always like fall short of like the perfect image of like what the person who reads XYZ should be. You know, we can never fully bridge the gap between like what we think we should be and what the things we like take in tell us we should be and what we are, which is again a person like living in history, like a subject who is free in some ways and constrained in others.
Yeah. And who has like, you know, social relations as well, which are their own sort of freeing and constraining things.
Yeah. And yeah, like that's really what I took away from it, is that we're all the fraud. Like the fraud is us. Yeah. The fraud is society. The fraud is being an individual. I don't know. Again, like I said, that's such like a hacky answer on one level, because it's like, oh, it's everybody, but it's like, it is. What can you say?
Well, yeah, and I think it applies to what Zadie Smith kind of wants to say, because like, yeah, like, you know, what should a novelist say about something? And it's like, well, if the novelist thinks like what the true thing is, then they should just depict that. But a good novelist knows that, like, you know, it's more difficult, it's more interesting, it's more complex.
Yeah.
And sort of presenting it that way, I think is supposed to actually get you to think and maybe be a different person, as opposed to just getting the answer or like the truth, well, like, you know, whatever that is.
I've been thinking a little bit about like, let's take this book and let's cut it apart a little bit. So we've already kind of talked about the first part kind of is a little dull. Doesn't quite work. The second part we really liked, but would it work if you took out the first part? Could we just have a book that's just this slave narrative, basically, and would maybe be truer, but would it be as good to read? Is there something true being shown or said by comparing and contrasting these things? You know, this is like a very like, I think formally like innovative and like deft novel. I mean, it's not like experimental exactly, but it's showing like a lot of confidence and like playing around with like form in a way that I think a lot of even mainstream like popular writers would not feel comfortable doing.
Especially, I think, letting the kind of Bogle stuff wait until the part where it's fully given the space to, because like, you know, the first part jumps around so much, she could have just easily jumped to Bogle's perspective, but instead it's like, you just get it all.
She lets us sit.
Like it's like
and you know, I think that again, that's kind of again showing that there is value in like doing craft stuff and actually caring about like art qua art, versus just being like, I am the socialist realist novelist and I'm going to show you the unflinching like look at what reality is. And maybe it's truer in the sense that like maybe you see like the horror like more immediately, but maybe you get bored halfway through and you don't finish it. You know, I think back to when I was in high school, I have this anecdote where in my history class, I think this is probably actually not a super uncommon thing. We read The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, but partially we only read part of it. We only read the first part.
Interesting.
Where, you know, all the factory stuff. And then once like it becomes a politics novel at the end, we stopped because the teacher was like, that's boring. He also probably was like, why would I have these kids read all this socialist stuff when I'm trying to teach them about the clean food and drug addicts? But I mean, I do think that probably a lot of people do kind of put that novel down at a certain point because they're not there to get like lectured.
Right. Yeah. And it becomes like and then it's like, well, what do we do about this? Well, clearly we unionize, you know, we push back, but like, you know, for some people that's not interesting, but that's like what needed to be presented.
Yeah.
It's like, well, yeah, what do we do about this horrible stuff?
Yeah. And again, like that's the thing with this novel that is again, maybe this is again kind of what she's doing with the historical fiction is, I think again, if she was writing this, I don't know what you would do to like tell this story contemporaneously. Like, I don't know that you could obviously couldn't tell this exact story contemporaneously, but there's maybe a similar novel you could do that takes place in 2023. But I feel like there would be more of a call for it to say like, what do we do about this? Whereas by situating it historically, you can leave these questions to breathe because at some level, in some ways they're settled. In a lot of ways, they're still not settled. But in some ways, we can't do anything about the Fitchburn case. It already ended.
Right. Yeah, and I also think too, like, authenticity is an interesting word because it's like, I think if you read the afterword, which we didn't exactly touch on, I don't know if we have to, but Zadie Smith's sort of like, you know, Elijah Touche is a character that I wanted to talk about. Like, I wanted to talk about who Elijah Touche is from like almost a historical perspective. And I think what's interesting in the afterword is like, she doesn't really say why. Like, it's just like, oh, I should just talk about this. And I think like that's an interesting impetus too, to like, you know, I want to tell Eliza's story. There's a difference between like presenting it straight and presenting it as juxtaposed with all of this other stuff. And I think like that sort of back and forth is like the important part. And I think, yeah, if she had said it now, I don't know, it would have been almost like too current.
Yeah.
Like people would have been, it's like the fact that it said some remove allows us to think about it a little bit more, like sit with it, like you said, for, you know, for the Boggle stuff.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, I don't know. I like the, like, so another book I'm reading is The Wager by David Grann, who, you know, he's the guy that wrote Flower Moon, the Killers of the Flower Moon book. And in that one, he's just kind of like, you know, I'm telling a story because I think it's cool. and like that's certainly a fine reason for a book. But when he tries to like make the story matter to other ideas, and like The Wager is about this shipwreck that like happened during the height of like, you know, England's sort of nautical colonial power. And like what happens is the shipwreck happens as a result of like problems with the leadership. And one side has their story about what happens, and the other side has their story. And he's like, I'm going to tell these two stories, and it's going to be about what is truth. You know, that's what he says. Like, we all have our stories to tell. And I just remember going like, yeah, okay, sure. Like, and you can tell like he's done all of this like great historical research, and like that's kind of the story, not like what is it about. And I think like Zadie Smith like has done clearly historical research, but it's more about like, yeah, what happens when I put these two narratives side by side? What does that say about like, what does it mean to read? Why should we care about art? And why should we care about like social stuff? Because I would say it is a social novel.
Absolutely.
And that to me is much more interesting than just kind of, look at me, I've reported all the facts of the situation of this, like, you know, this seafaring tale.
Yeah, if you want to read a textbook, just read a textbook.
Right. And like, you know, he tries to interject some stuff in it and whatnot, but like, I think he's more just like, this story needs to be told, kind of like
it's
with
almost
Flower
like
Moon
journalistic in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think literature can get towards more interesting stuff because it's like, it's not concerned with the journalism aspect of it.
Yeah. Well, because crucially, I think the afterword does state that like a lot of this is conjecture on Smith's part. Like, it's not like a lot of the events around like Touche's life are conjecture. We don't have like her. It's not like she like got her hands like her diary and like, you know, presented everything exactly as she found it. Like, there's a lot here where she's reading between the lines and projecting back on this person in the past.
I like this line in the afterword, by the way. Mrs. Touche, a woman always partly phantasmagoric, extends herself far beyond her earthly span here. In reality, she died before her cousin on the 4th of February. So yeah, he has William die first. But I like that aside. She's always partly phantasmagoric. It's like, yeah, we don't know exactly what's going on here, but.
Well, great book. I think we both kind of thought for a little bit this might be the first one we read that we didn't like. Still hasn't happened yet, which I'm happy for. We'll see, I guess.
An uninterrupted John, nothing but W's. We're just never gonna read anything we don't like. Just
buckets.
Buckets, turkey. We got strikes. We got it all. So
come to the Infinite Library. The winning never stops. Always hitting jackpots.
Every book is a great book. Yeah.
Do we want to do Rex and then close the door on the fraud?
Yeah, I think so. I honestly don't know what I would rec. I actually ended up thinking a lot about Marlon James, A Brief History of Seven Killings while I was reading this, because I mean, one, true, it is Jamaica. That'd be the surface connection. But the fact that in this, Marlon James kind of gives every character their true say, despite kind of any contradictions or complexities that might happen. And I would say Brief Histories of Seven Killing is kind of a realist novel. There's not quite the sort of, I think, you were pointing out, John, kind of slightly unrealistic things that happen in this, but having characters speak what happens to them in a true and unique way, I think is really cool. And I particularly like those kinds of books more than I like the ones that stick to the third person remove, God mode.
Yeah.
I like it when it gets really in the weeds, so to speak, of a character's psyche. And so and I would say Brief History of Seven Killings does that too.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that's more of my connection with that book rather than both being about Jamaica. But something about the friction that happens when you have Bogle speak his whole mind is kind of what I get from Seven Killings.
Yeah.
I would say, Brief History of Seven Killings by Marlon James would be, if you want more of this, but a different angle, I think.
Well, I also have a book that's maybe kind of more of this, but a different angle. My recommendation for this week, if you read The Fraud and you liked it, is going to be The Night Ocean by Paul Lafarge, which is a book I read a couple years ago and absolutely adored. I think I told you a little bit about it at one point, Ben. Kind of a brief little thing. It is a book kind of like this where it seems like one thing at the beginning, and then you realize that it's a different thing. But in this case, also, it does another turn, and you find out it's actually a secret third thing. Because it actually does something very interesting where the beginning starts very exciting, and then it takes a turn that actually seems like it's going to be very disappointing, and it's a huge letdown. I remember getting 3/4 of the way through that book and thinking oh, I hate this. I want this to end. and then all of a sudden it takes a huge second turn, and all of a sudden it's oh, this fucking rules so hard.
Wow, it sounds great.
Yeah. But kind of brief overview, starts off the kind of one page, no spoilers idea is it's a guy, he thinks he finds some letters that prove that H.P. Lovecraft is gay, and he's trying to track down the source of these letters to confirm it one way or the other. And then there's some twists and turns from there. So in terms of kind of a literary novel, because this is definitely lit fic despite the Lovecraft connection, that comes across as very conventional to start and then makes a big left turn, and all of a sudden you are a different planet. That one gets a big 2 thumbs up from me, along with The Fraud.
All right, this sounds great. I'm gonna check that out. I like the premise.
We might want to do that for an ep at some point. It's a great fall read.
Cool. Yeah.
All right. Well, listeners, thank you again so much for joining us. We really appreciate your continued listenership. 2023 was a good first year, I think. Obviously, we kind of started this a little late into the year, but I think 2024 is going to be a big year for the podcast, and we really hope you guys stay with us and keep on reading.
Yeah, keep on reading. Semper Books.
Semper Books. Thank you for listening to the Infinite Library. If you liked our show, we hope you'll subscribe and leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or the podcast app of your choice. It helps us a lot. If you want to follow us on social media, we can be found on Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky at Infinite Library Pod. If you'd like to contact our team directly with episode ideas or feedback, you can email us at infinitelibrarypod@gmail.com. Our intro music is by Amos Legend in the Forest of Mayhem. Our outro music is by DJ Daggy Diggs, and our logo was created by Lars Noir. You can support our show by supporting them. We hope you'll join us back in the stacks for the next episode soon. Semper Books, bookheads.